Thank you for tuning in to the RHAWA YouTube channel. Please enjoy this special presentation with George Petrie and Audrey Riddle of Goodman Real Estate.
No housing for today and tomorrow. We're going to talk about two big problems. Housing is complicated and legislation. The relationship between the housing provider and the resident has been compromised. The root issue is the pendulum between compassion and accountability has moved, and the impacts are manifesting themselves in the destruction of quiet enjoyment of the residents, the economic viability of the housing provider, and the degradation of the neighborhood. It's been said that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and from our lived experience, this is proving true. Housing in Seattle is crumbling, and those of modest incomes are suffering the most. Now is the time to act and change the root cause, legislation.
We are going to shine a bright light on these problems using one of the buildings in Seattle, the Addison Apartments. It is a story of one of the oldest and significant buildings in the International District. Known in 1911 as the New Richmond Hotel, rooms rented for $1 a night. Fast forward 50 years to the 1960s, and the Diamond had become a little rough. In 1969, lightly renovated and converted to apartments at 80% AMI. It served as the Downtowner Apartments, as naturally occurring, affordable housing for over 40 years on a HUD loan. 14 years ago, in 2010, GRE entered the picture, and the Diamond was more than rough, it was all but crushed, with compromised functioning infrastructure of electrical, plumbing, exterior, roof, and units completely worn out. An argument could have been made to tear it down.
But we didn't tear it down. We invested in the Addison to care for the residents and to move the community toward another century of housing.
Creating housing is complicated, and so to walk us through how housing is complicated, we'll use the Addison Apartments. It starts with our residents, people of modest incomes that want to live in housing that provides healthy and a safe environment. Then the owner and developer will take point and act as a champion and a conductor to assemble the team to make this all happen.
The developer adds to the team investors and lenders who provide the financial resources.
So over $26 million in over 3 years. The renovation updated plumbing, there were new appliances, new common areas, new amenity spaces, electrical, earthquake upgrades. We added 14 apartments, totaling 254 apartments. This is studios and 1 bedrooms for the community. We also created 46 artist and music studios to support the vibrancy of the city and to participate in the local art walks.
Up next, government influence, both helpful and hurtful, is present throughout the creation of housing. Rules, regulations, permits, inspections, final approvals, and in some cases funding. It's difficult to overestimate the amount of friction that government puts in place and how long it takes to overcome it.
So the Washington State Housing Finance Commission and the IRS awarded the tax credits, and HUD sets the rents. And this looks really complicated because it is. This process took 3 years and a total of $38 million. How many people, George, do you think were used in the development and the construction and ultimately our residents impacted by this community?
I wouldn't be surprised if we counted it up. It's over 300, maybe even 400 people.
Wow. Fantastic. So now we have this housing, we have welcomed all of our residents, and now it's operating and it's running. What's our next step?
Well, maintaining housing. This slide speaks for itself. Once created, a community must be maintained indefinitely to flourish. The alternative is it dies and in the end is repurposed or demolished. That's what nearly happened to the Addison. I want to talk about quiet enjoyment for a minute. An individual's behavior has a profound impact on their larger community. Sometimes for better, and oftentimes for worse. Some of the legislation over the past few years has taken away the housing providers' and residents' ability to enforce quiet enjoyment. Said differently, legislation has encouraged unrestrained selfishness, and there is almost nothing another resident or housing provider can do about it. And if they can, it is a profound amount of time and money. There have been significant legislative changes over the past 14 years, 57. Let me say that again, 57 changes to be exact. Think about that. Between 1973 and 2010, on average, there was 1 change every 4 years. In the past 14 years, there has been 4 changes per year. Think about that. What's the impact? communities of stability have turned into communities of chaos. Neighborhoods rocked with drug use, tenant-on-tenant violence has skyrocketed, intentional property damage resulting in large expenses for the housing provider, all unnecessary and all unsustainable. Total and complete chaos.
As we don't have time to walk through each of these laws, from our vantage point for Addison, we're going to highlight 6 of these laws that have most impacted the residents and continue to impact their daily lives. Fair chance housing, the roommate ordinance, eviction moratoriums, the 180-day rent increase, relocation on rent increases of more than 10% known as the EDRA, and the $10 late fee cap. Let's walk through each of these. First off, in 2018, the Fair Chance Housing removes the ability for a housing provider to screen for criminal backgrounds as part of the application to move in. This had great intention, how to allow residents with criminal backgrounds opportunities to housing.
But there was a real negative impact. One of the examples from the Addison is a resident who stabbed their guest, thankfully not fatally. But we later learned through the process with their arrest that they had open warrants in other states, and that had they applied before the law went into effect, they likely would not have been permitted to move into the community.
In 2019, the roommate ordinance allows a resident to add additional family members to their lease without housing provider consent. This had a great intention, how to allow family members the ability to add to their lease, but this had a negative impact to our residents. This made it impossible for the housing provider to control who is living in the units. In 2020, the COVID eviction moratorium had an impact. What we're going to focus on is the greater impact of the ongoing moratoriums that are still in effect today. In place today are the school year and the winter eviction moratorium that is over a certain designated number of months, and this had a good intention as well.
But this law encourages rather than discourages residents to not pay their rent. Bad actors take advantage of the process and know how to work the system.
In 2021, the 180-day rent increase came into law. This requires 180 days notice of a rent increase to all residents. For the Addison apartments, this policy limits the ability to implement the rent amounts determined by HUD for 6 months. This had a good intention, to allow planning for residents. However, there is true negative impact.
The housing provider is now trying to forecast where rents will be 6 months out, and they err on the high side, which puts in place higher rents and lowers occupancy. This law actually causes higher rents.
In 2022, the EDRA, or relocation assistance, if the rent increases by 10% or more, established a penalty paid to the resident by the housing provider. The resident moves out and then applies for this 3 months of the new rental amount. This had a good intention to provide assistance to low-income households.
For Addison, 100% of the residents would qualify as the residents are or at below 60% AMI. And in fact, in 2024, HUD came out with the new rent amounts and it exceeded 10%. Therefore, if we followed the guidance of HUD, 100% of our residents would qualify, and Addison would be having to pay over $4,000 per resident who moves out.
Next, in 2023, the late fee caps were implemented. This law limits late fees at $10 regardless of the rental rate, whether your rent is $300 due to having a voucher or $1,600.
This law creates a moral hazard. Why should a resident pay at all? Late fees are an accountability tool that encourages timely payment of rent, which supports the economic stability of the community. Often, legislation starts with a preamble, which is an introductory part of a law stating its purpose, goal, and justification. As a housing provider, we have a preamble that includes health, safety, and welfare of the community, residents, and economic stability. Today, we have 8 indicators to measure if we are achieving the goals. When we look at community, we have 4 indicators: online reviews, number of evictions, non-payment of rent, and 911 calls.
When looking at residents, we have 2 indicators: life and safety, and capital improvements, and employee turnover.
And finally, economic stability. We have 2 indicators: cash flow and overall economic impact. Let's step through all 8 indicators and take a look at the data for Addison.
Our first indicator is online reviews. The data shows us that as these laws were implemented, it impacted the brand and the lived experience for our residents and how they feel about where they live.
It went from good to bad. This tells me that the residents in 2016 enjoyed living at Addison, and by 2023, that is not the case. In fact, one of our reviews says, "Run, don't walk from the Addison."
The second indicator is the number of evictions filed each year.
Evicting residents is not a part of the business model. It is a tragic but necessary tool of accountability. The data shows us that Addison had very few evictions prior to 2017, less than 6%. When we stopped screening for criminal background, the impact was immediate and negative. Evictions went from 6% in 2017 to 14% in 2018, and a whopping 25% in 2019.
The third indicator is non-payment of rent. The data shows us that in 2022 and 2023, there are many of our residents did not pay their rent. In fact, in 2020 and 2021, Addison received over $500,000 of CARES rental assistance for our residents. The story would have been even worse, but it also tells us it was not enough.
The data shows us that in 2016, 17, and 18, residents were paying their rent. Then with the implementation of this law, things changed.
The fourth indicator is 911 calls per year.
The Addison apartments have been experiencing a concerning increase in 911 calls, primarily due to problematic resident behavior and adverse environmental conditions affecting both the interior and the surrounding public areas of the building.
The fifth indicator is life safety and capital improvements. What were the operation expenses to guard and protect the health, safety, and welfare of our residents?
In 2020, a substantial amount of the $800,000 that was spent that year was dedicated to addressing the various security and maintenance concerns. Specifically, it became necessary to deploy armed security at the Addison and install cameras to safeguard residents while also adhering to our obligations as housing providers.
Our sixth indicator is employee turnover. What is the number of team members each year that leave their role?
Would you want to work in an environment where chaos was king? Most people do not. A sad and tragic but telling statistic is employee turnover at the Addison. It's skyrocketed. Residents threatened, cursed at, and in few cases assaulted many of the employees.
Our seventh indicator is economic instability. What is the annual income for the community? Was there profit or was there loss at the end of the year?
This is not stability. We went from a forecast of making $200,000 a year to unsustainable losses of millions. This does not in any way promote health, safety, and welfare of the community, resident, or economic stability of the project.
The last indicator is our graph showing the profit in green and the losses in red, the expenses and the overall revenue for the community.
Said differently, this is unsustainable. Note how we went from achieving our modest forecasted profitability to profound losses and the correlation with the laws that were passed. Now we layer in the vacancy rate, and all you see is a downward trend. People wanted to live there, and now they don't. The negative reviews, the unmanaged living environment, the economic instability. Would you want to live there?
Would you? An unreported 2-year leak that cost over $40,000. This resident moved in February of 2020 with a rent amount of $1,100 a month. They received over $20,000 in assistance, but never made a rental payment. We began the eviction in 2022, and through the many delays in the eviction process, the resident vacated in 2024. Their balance was over $36,000, and with possession, we found an unreported leak. It cost over $40,000 on vacancy loss to turn the unit, new cabinets due to water damage, and overall drywall repair. Drug use is unfortunately a circumstance that occurs in the apartments and surrounding the community as well as in our common areas. The safety of team members, the neighbors are impacted. Consequently, the cost to refurbish and prepare a unit for new occupants has escalated to approximately $10,000 per turn, reflecting a significant investment required to maintain the property standards.
It says it all. The road to default is paved with good intentions. Play on words, but unfortunately it is true. Legislative good intentions put in place by people with empathy have resulted in the complete destruction of the health, safety, and welfare of the residents of the Addison, the neighborhood of the Addison, and the physical condition of the Addison, and finally, the economic stability of the Addison. $8 million have been lost through 2024.
The building is in default with the lender, and the value has dropped from about $40 million to perhaps as low as $10 million, which is below the debt amount owed to the lender. Who loses? The resident? The developer? The neighbors? The policymakers? Everyone is losing. This is not healthy, nor safe, nor welfare. The following quotes are for the application submitted to the City of Seattle Office of Housing in 2024, in which they awarded $14 million to over 20 housing providers in the city. This covered their operating expenses, payroll losses due to non-payment of rent, and overall increased expenses due to resident behavior.
So we know we're not alone. The Addison is not unique. It's only going to get worse. So where do we go from here? It's a call to action. Say no and demand accountability and change. The laws enacted have destroyed housing creation and maintenance, especially affordable housing. It cannot be understated. Further misguided policies such as rent stabilization or rent control will only dance on the graves of residents and housing providers. Support immediate changes to existing laws that move toward the support of residents, housing creation, and maintenance.
Thank you for listening. For more information, check out rhawa.org.